Hello everyone, I'm Justin, and this is everything you need to know before watching Saw X, releasing September 29th. If you end up enjoying this video and want to see more from us, then make sure to click that subscribe button and click the bell to know anytime we upload a new video. Back in October of 2004, the very first Saw film was released and left an immediate impact on the horror genre, gaining a level of popularity that allowed the creators behind it to make 8 more films, with 6 of those coming in consecutive years from 2005 to 2010, while the last 2 came out in 2017 and 2021 respectively. And now, about 19 years after the beginning of the franchise, it will finally be releasing its 10th installment with Saw X, which, despite being the 10th film in the franchise, is actually a direct sequel to the original, set around late 2004 to early 2005, prior to the events of Saw 2. But still, we think it'll definitely be useful to know everything that takes place from 2005 and on before you go see the new movie. So we'll be covering the whole franchise here, primarily in timeline order. To begin, let's introduce Jigsaw himself, John Kramer, who, before he began constructing traps for his victims, was a successful civil engineer and co-founder, along with his friend and lawyer Art Blank, of the Urban Renewal Group, a real estate company dedicated to property development for people in need. While in his personal life, he was married to a woman named Jill Tuck, who herself was owner of the Homeward Bound Clinic, a recovery clinic for drug addicts. By 1994, John and Jill received news that they'd be adding another member to their family, as Jill wound up pregnant with their child, whom they planned to name Gideon after John's first purchase under the Urban Renewal Group, the Gideon Meatpacking Plant, and had also planned to birth in 1995, the Chinese Year of the Pig. 7 months into her pregnancy, though, their lives took an unfortunate turn, as while Jill was locking up her clinic one night, one of her patients, Cecil Adams, at the behest of another junkie named Amanda Young, forced her a knife point to let him inside so he could steal some medication, and as he then came rushing out the door, he inadvertently slammed into Jill's pregnant belly. Cecil then ran out of the building, while Amanda hid in a dark corner, before John, who'd been outside waiting for Jill, and after witnessing Cecil exit a few moments prior, rushed inside himself, where Jill was left heavily bleeding, and when he eventually got her to the hospital, they were informed that their child's life had been lost. As a result of Gideon's death, John fell into a deep depression that led him to later withdraw from the Urban Renewal Group, as well as grow distant from Jill, resulting in their divorce. And soon, things became even worse for John when he was diagnosed with terminal cancer at Angel of Mercy Hospital by renowned oncologist Dr. Lawrence Gordon, which actually could have been discovered much sooner if it weren't for one of the hospital's residents, Logan Nelson, accidentally mixing up the label of his x-rays with another patient's. So, with his life appearing to have reached an irreversible low, John decided to try and end his suffering by driving his car off a cliff. But to his surprise, he actually survived the plunge, and although severely injured, he decided to continue fighting to stay alive, bringing him to the realization that he'd only learned to cherish his life when his death was imminent. So, from that day forward, he decides to spend whatever time he has left testing other people's will to live in hopes they'd learn to cherish their lives as he has. For his first test, he turns his focus onto Cecil, who John, disguised in a pig mask, manages to kidnap during a Year of the Pig street festival before taking him to his workshop and placing him in a trap with 8 horizontally arranged knives positioned in front of Cecil's face, connected to arm and leg restraints binding him to his chair, which John explains he'll only be able to free himself from by pressing his face through the knives. So Cecil begins doing just that, but the device ultimately fails to work in the way John had intended, as his thrashing just results in it falling apart beneath him, allowing Cecil to then rush at John, but he simply sidesteps, and Cecil instead runs directly into a barbed wire crib. Once Cecil's passed, John carves out a jigsaw puzzle piece from his skin as a symbol that he was missing a vital piece of the human puzzle, the survival instinct, before then disposing of his body, later to be found by the authorities. Jill soon learns of Cecil's death in the newspaper, and so she goes to meet with John at his workshop, where she discovers photos of Cecil scattered around, ultimately leading John to reveal the role he played in his murder, with him claiming to have taught him not to take life for granted. And this proves to be too much for Jill, who decides to exit John's life. Despite losing communication with his now ex-wife, John continues moving ahead with his mission, and prepares a huge game at Jill's old abandoned pig farm, in which he'll be testing 5 individuals whose actions were responsible for another person's death. With those 5 people including Ryan, whose drunken antics when he was young led to the death of 2 of his friends in a car accident, Carly, who'd stolen a woman's purse and inadvertently her inhaler, resulting in the woman dying from an asthma attack shortly after, Mitch, who'd knowingly sold a motorcycle with faulty brakes to a young man who it turns out was actually actually John Kramer's nephew, which resulted in his death, Anna, John's former next-door neighbor who, despite claiming to the authorities that her husband had suffocated their infant child by laying on him in his sleep, had actually intentionally suffocated their child to death herself after it wouldn't stop crying, which John was able to overhear. And Logan Nelson, the hospital resident who'd mixed up John's x-rays. For their test, John also creates a mechanical ventriloquist puppet named Billy as a means of delivering instructions or other messages during the games, and he continues using Billy for his future tests as well. Once having sedated and kidnapped his 5 victims, John places them in the barn's first trap, which sees each of them with a bucket locked on their heads, attached to a chain that slowly begins dragging them towards a wall of saws that they'll only be able to escape from by giving a blood sacrifice. So each of them do, except for Logan, whose sedation takes much longer to wear off than the others, nearly resulting in him being sliced to death as the other 4 move on to their next test. But fortunately for him, he's saved in the nick of time by John, who at the last second decides that Logan doesn't deserve to die for an honest mistake. While John tends to Logan's wounds, the others continue on with their tests, and eventually they each fail, with Carly falling victim to a combination of lethal syringes, Mitch getting mutilated by the cycle trap, Anna inadvertently shooting herself in the face with a backfiring shotgun, and Ryan bleeding to death after having to slice off his own leg. In the aftermath of the murderer's trial, John, once Logan's recovered from his injuries, actually convinces him to join him in his mission, and Logan chooses to accept his offer since he feels he owes John for the careless mistake he made in completely altering John's life. So for John's next several test subjects, Logan would help him create and set up each of his traps, with him even helping build one of Jigsaw's most iconic traps, the reverse bear trap. But their partnership ultimately wouldn't last too long, as in 2003 up until 2005, Logan decides to join and serve for the US Army. This wouldn't be much of a problem for John though, as he soon found himself a new apprentice in the form of Detective Mark Hoffman. A few years back, Hoffman had suffered the loss of the only family he had left, his sister Angelina, who was brutally murdered by her ex-boyfriend Seth Baxter. And although Seth was arrested and sentenced to life in prison, he ended up being released on a technicality just a few years later. So Hoffman, filled with anger and seeking vengeance, decided to take matters into his own hands and set up his murder, disguising it as just another jigsaw trap so no one would suspect he had any involvement in it. But it didn't take long for John to learn of what Hoffman had done, before then ambushing and incapacitating him shortly after. When Hoffman later woke, he found himself strapped to a chair with a shotgun aimed at his head, as Jigsaw berated him for imitating his work in order to commit murder, which he claims he himself has never done, as his tests only serve to rehabilitate his victims.
Killing is distasteful!
But rather than putting Hoffman through a test of his own for his actions, Jigsaw instead uses his knowledge of what he's done to somewhat blackmail Hoffman into working for him, which ultimately works. The first of John's tests we see Hoffman assisting him with takes place in 2004 and is for a guy named Paul, a patient at Jill's recovery clinic who'd been cutting himself, and who, for his test, John has Hoffman place in a razor wire maze that'll only be able to escape by cutting himself again and again. As the two are setting up the trap, Hoffman informs John that one of his colleagues, Detective David Tapp, has been inching closer and closer to uncovering Jigsaw's true identity. So, to throw the detective off his trail, John places a penlight at the scene that belongs to his doctor, Lawrence Gordon, who he claims is a healer in need of healing. Before we focus more on Dr. Gordon though, there's another victim John shifts his attention onto, with that being the previously mentioned Amanda Young, who John still doesn't know was involved in the death of his son, but rather has chosen to test for being a self-destructive drug addict. For her test, John places her in the reverse bear trap he and Logan had built and locks her in a cell alongside another of Jill's patients named Donnie Greco, who John's injected with an opiate overdose, rendering him immobile, and had swallowed the key to the device around Amanda's head, which will go off and kill her if she's unable to unlock it within the next 60 seconds. So, with her having no other way of survival, Amanda grabs the knife placed beside Donnie and repeatedly stabs him in the stomach until she manages to reach the key, which she then uses to unlock and remove the device, enabling her to escape. Back to the previously mentioned Detective Tapp though, as about 3 weeks after John and Hoffman set up Paul's trap, Tapp, Detective Steven Singh, and Detective Allison Carey discover Paul's dead body strung up in the razor wire maze, as well as the penlight Jigsaw had left at the scene, on which they uncovered Dr. Gordon's fingerprints. So they bring Gordon in for questioning, but he actually has a viable alibi for when the test took place, as he'd been out that night and engaging in an affair with a medical student of his named Carla, hence why he's caught Jigsaw's attention. But once having cleared things up, Gordon doesn't immediately return home, and he instead stays back for a moment to hear Amanda's testimony in the next room, who informs the detectives of what took place during her test, but surprisingly claims that what Jigsaw put her through has actually helped her. Jigsaw is very much aware of Amanda's feelings of gratitude towards him, and he later decides to meet with her at her apartment and offer her an apprenticeship under him, which she accepts. Despite gaining even more assistance though, Jigsaw's Detective Tap problem still remains, as Tap, through the Billy the Puppet message Jigsaw played during Amanda's trap, has now managed to deduce the location from which it had been recorded. So he and Detective Singh head over to said location and find what appears to be Jigsaw's base of operations, inside of which they also stumble upon a hooded Jigsaw and his next victim, Jeff Ridenour, who he's already placed in a trap. Before they can arrest Jigsaw or learn of his true identity though, he manages to start up the trap, so Singh's forced to turn his attention towards shutting it down, which he eventually manages to do after shooting it to pieces. But still, this distraction allows Jigsaw the opportunity to slash Tap's throat and make a run for it, as Singh continues chasing after him. And Singh's chase ultimately leads to his own demise, when he steps right into a booby trap that results in multiple shotguns firing down onto his head and killing him. Tap fortunately doesn't end up suffering the same fate as Singh, as he's later found and patched up. But since he and Singh had invaded Jigsaw's hideout without a warrant, he's ultimately discharged from the force. Despite no longer being a detective though, Tap continues on with his pursuit of Jigsaw alone, and becomes completely obsessed with tracking him down, causing his mental state to rapidly deteriorate. And with no other main suspects, the primary focus of his investigation is still on Dr. Gordon, who, in order to keep an eye on him 24/7, Tap actually buys an apartment across the street from, in addition to hiring a freelance photographer named Adam Stanhite to observe him. But unfortunately for Adam, his work soon catches the attention of Jigsaw, who'd already been putting together a test for Gordon, so he decides to include Adam in the game as well, and sends Amanda to kidnap each of them as her first assignment. For this upcoming test, Jigsaw also includes one of Angel of Mercy Hospital's orderlies, Zepp Hindle, who, for his part in the test, John injects with a slow-acting poison and leaves with an audio tape instructing him to hold Dr. Gordon's wife Allison and daughter Diana captive at the doctor's apartment and watch via video feed as Gordon and Adam's game takes place, which Gordon must win by 6, or else Zepp will be forced to kill him in order to receive the poison's antidote. As Zepp was handling his assignment, Amanda managed to successfully complete hers, and now takes the two to a dilapidated bathroom in an underground tunnel network, and chains their ankles to pipes in corners across from one another, while John applies fake blood and makeup to his face to make it appear he'd shot himself, before injecting himself with a substance that slows his heart rate and relaxes his muscles, allowing him to lay completely still in the middle of the room for the duration of the game, with a gun in one hand and a tape recorder in the other. So, with everything set up, Amanda tosses the key to Adam's chain into the bathtub with him and exits to allow the game to begin. Although, Adam doesn't end up getting the opportunity to use said key, since, upon awakening, he unknowingly allows it to fall down the bathtub's drain. With both him and Gordon now awake though, the two are quickly able to learn the objective of the game through an audio tape in Gordon's pocket, which reveals that if Gordon doesn't kill Adam by 6, his wife and daughter will die. Also on the tape, Gordon notices a faint whisper saying, "Follow your heart," which subsequently leads him to notice a heart drawn on the toilet tank. So Adam takes a look inside and finds a bag containing 2 hacksaws, as well as all of Adam's photos of Dr. Gordon, but Adam chooses not to reveal them to him for now, and instead, they try and ultimately fail to cut through their chains.
He doesn't want us to cut through our chains. He wants us to cut through our feet.
As they contemplate what to do next, Gordon tells Adam a bit about his family, even pulling out his wallet to show him a picture of them. But in his wallet, they instead find a photo left by Jigsaw of Allison and Diana tied up with a note on the back reading,
X marks the spot. Sometimes you see more with your eyes shut.
And they eventually realize the meaning of this note and turn the lights off to reveal a glow-in-the-dark X painted on the wall, which Gordon then breaks down to uncover a lockbox containing a cell phone, but it unfortunately is only meant to receive calls, as they soon do from Gordon's wife and daughter held at gunpoint by Zepp, who tell Gordon, as instructed by Zepp, to not trust Adam's lies. This warning ultimately forces Adam to reveal how he knows Gordon, as well as the photos he took of him. But upon revealing these photos, Adam also notices one he hadn't taken of Zepp, who Gordon recognizes in Gordon's apartment, before the two then realize that their time is up, as it's now 6 o'clock. So Zepp calls up Gordon and places the phone against Allison's ear once again, but this ends up giving her an opportunity to lunge at and attempt to wrestle the gun away from him, resulting in it firing multiple times, which immediately gains the attention of Detective Tapp across the street, prompting him to rush inside and engage in a gunfight with Zepp, all of which Gordon hears over the phone. So Gordon, in a last-ditch effort to potentially save his family, grabs the hacksaw and chops off his foot, before then dragging himself over to the gun in the supposedly dead man's hand and shooting at him with it. As he was doing that though, Zepp, whose gunfight with Tapp had allowed Gordon's family to escape, began making his way to the bathroom with Tapp on his trail, who Zepp is eventually forced to kill, and so he does so with a gunshot through his chest before then entering the bathroom to kill Gordon, since his attempt on Adam's life had still come too late. But before he can kill him, Zepp stripped to the ground and has his head bashed in with the toilet tank lid by Adam. A footless Gordon then leaves to try and get them help, while Adam finds and listens to an audio tape from Zepp's pocket that reveals he was in fact not the mastermind behind it all. Just before John Kramer then rises to his feet and slams the bathroom door shut, leaving Adam trapped in there to die.
Game over.
Gordon, meanwhile, due to his injury and severe blood loss, is unable to make it very far, but he does at least manage to make it to a steaming pipe in the hallway that he, in an attempt to close his wound, presses his stump against to cauterize it, and it fortunately works, but causes him to pass out. Shortly after losing consciousness though, he's found by John Kramer, who congratulates the doctor for surviving before taking him to a separate room to treat his wound. And Gordon, in return for John saving his life and having been rehabilitated by the test he'd been put through, decides to begin acting as another of Jigsaw's apprentices. Adam, on the other hand though, remains trapped in the dilapidated bathroom for the next few days, until he's suddenly met by Amanda, who's become somewhat overwhelmed with guilt, knowing he's just slowly dying in there, and has decided to show him mercy, although she can't just let him go since that would be against the rules of John's game. So instead, she suffocates him to death with a plastic bag to put him out of his misery. Some point after this, and before everything else we're about to talk about, is right about when the upcoming Saw X will be taking place. So I just want to quickly reiterate that almost everything that takes place beyond this point in the video happens after the new film. For Jigsaw's next big game, which will be taking place in 2005, he shifts his focus onto a corrupt detective named Eric Matthews, who we learn had faked evidence in multiple cases to wrongfully arrest several innocent people, including Amanda, and was known to be violent and aggressive towards suspects. In addition to that, he'd also somewhat recently had a falling out with his wife after she learned he'd been engaging in an affair with a fellow detective, the previously mentioned Allison Carey. So, for Eric's test, John, with Hoffman's help, modifies an abandoned house and connects it to the underground tunnels leading to the dilapidated bathroom via trap door, before then kidnapping 6 of the people wrongfully incarcerated by Eric, named Jonas, Gus, Addison, Xavier, Laura, and Abby, and placing them inside the house along with Eric's son, Daniel, as nerve gas is pumped in through the vents, which will kill each of them within the next 2 hours if they're unable to find the several syringes containing the antidote hidden throughout the house, and keep themselves alive until the 3rd hour when all the doors to the house unlock. Also for the game, John decides to have Amanda take part in it so that she can secretly guide them through and ultimately lead Daniel down to the dilapidated bathroom unharmed, which is exactly what she manages to do as the other 6 participants die off, with Gus getting himself shot in the face after attempting to unlock a door they were specifically told not to, Abby burning to death as he attempted to collect a couple syringes from within a furnace, Jonas being killed by a rampaging Xavier, Laura succumbing to the poison's effects, Addison bleeding to death after attempting to collect a syringe from a glass box, and Xavier, as he was attempting to kill Daniel and Amanda, having his throat slashed by Daniel with a hacksaw. With her and Daniel the only 2 left, Amanda then incapacitates and brings him to John to be locked inside a safe in preparation for Detective Matthews' actual test, which begins 2 days later as Jigsaw, after intentionally leaving a clue of his hideout's location at the crime scene of another trap for a man named Michael Marks, allows himself to be found by Matthews and a team of police officers while surrounded by monitors displaying footage of Daniel's game from 2 days prior, a fact he keeps hidden from the officers, leading them and Matthews to believe it's taking place right now. So, despite Jigsaw instructing Eric to remain where he is if he really wants to find his son, Eric becomes violent and forces John to take him to the game's location, which he does, leading Matthews all the way to the bathroom while back at his hideout, the safe holding Daniel suddenly opens, revealing him to still be alive. Once in the bathroom, Eric is suddenly attacked and knocked out by Amanda in a pig mask, who then chains him to a pipe and slams the door behind her to trap him inside. But shortly following her exit, Eric actually manages to escape the bathroom, having freed himself from his shackle by smashing and breaking his foot with the toilet tank lid before limping over to the door, which had been left unlocked. And immediately after freeing himself, Eric unleashes a brutal attack on Amanda in the hallway, demanding to know where his son is. But despite leaving her a bloody mess, Amanda's ultimately able to take him down by kicking out his broken leg, before then continuing the attack to leave him on the brink of death before exiting the building and going into hiding with John, since the police now know their identities. John, though, could tell by Amanda's injuries that something had gone sideways. So, without Amanda's knowledge, he instructs Hoffman to retrieve Matthews from the building and keep him alive for the time being, which Hoffman manages to do while still keeping his anonymity intact. Also during this time, Hoffman decides to remodel the nerve gas house into his own home, a decision that, we'll later see, ends up being pretty significant. Now in 2006, after 6 months of being in hiding, John and his accomplices start up the games once again, with John setting up the instruction messages from Billy the Puppet, while Hoffman and Amanda kidnap the upcoming victims and prepare their traps. Unlike John or even Hoffman's traps though, Amanda constructs hers to be unwinnable, as her encounter with Detective Matthews has now brought her to conclude that Jigsaw's games don't really change people, and so, if they're not going to change, then they deserve to die. As is the fate of her next victim, a criminal and drug addict named Troy, whose test sees him having to rip out 11 chains attached to various parts of his body before a nail bomb in front of him goes off, which he's ultimately unable to do. But even if he did manage to detach all 11 chains, Amanda had left the door welded shut to prevent him from escaping. Following Troy's failed test, Amanda's focus is next shifted onto Detective Carey, who, after being kidnapped, Amanda has strung up in the angel trap, which involves a device being bolted into Carey's ribcage that she'll only be able to unlock with the key at the bottom of the jar of acid placed beside her. But since this is another Amanda trap, even though Carey sacrifices some flesh to collect the key, it doesn't actually end up freeing her, and she's killed as a result. The more lives Amanda claims though, the worse her mental state gets. So, in an attempt to cope with it all, she begins cutting herself, which she tries to keep hidden from John by just cutting her inner thighs, but eventually, Jigsaw becomes aware of her rigged games and self-harm, and decides that she must once again be tested. So, he adds her into one of his next 2 big games, which will actually be going down simultaneously, since they'll likely be the last of his tests that he'll be alive to see play out, due to his cancer having gotten significantly worse during his and Amanda's 6 months in hiding. For these games, John primarily sets his focus onto 6 people, with one of those 6 being Amanda, while the other 5 include a couple named Jeff and Dr. Lynn Denlon, the former of whom's vengefulness and neglection of Lynn and their daughter Corbett as a result of their son Dylan being killed by a drunk driver named Timothy Young 3 years ago, had led the latter to begin engaging in an affair. Officer Daniel Rigg, one of Carey and Matthews' colleagues, who Jigsaw believes needs to learn how to let other people help themselves as well as cherish his own life, and Special Agents Peter Strom and Lindsay Perez, who following the death of Detective Carey, their informant in the Metropolitan Police Department, have taken over the Jigsaw case. As John and his accomplices are setting up these upcoming tests though, he's met at the game's location, revealed to be the Gideon meatpacking plant, by his ex-wife Jill, who, with his secret identity having been discovered and revealed to the world by this point, has now come in an attempt to convince him to stop. But he instead hands her a key that he claims she'll know what to do with when the time is right. Moving ahead to the games now, and since they take place at the same time, let's first run through the events of Jeff and Lynn's, which sees Jeff making his way through a series of tests relating to the death of their son, while Lynn, unaware that Jeff is at all involved in the game, deals with a test of her own to keep a bedridden John alive. As if he dies before Jeff's tests are complete, then the shotgun collar around her neck will activate and kill her. In addition, their game will also be serving as another test for Amanda, who John keeps Lynn and Jeff's relationship hidden from, so that, as far as she knows, Lynn's just any other doctor she has to watch over. And John's looking to use this situation to teach Amanda to control her emotions and fight off her urge to kill Lynn. As Jeff's tests continue on, and as Lynn prepares John for surgery to help prolong his life for a bit, Amanda and John get the chance to speak alone. And during their conversation, John informs her of an envelope in his desk that he wants her to open. So later, after Jeff's passed through nearly the entirety of his tests, and after the completion of John's surgery, she decides to take a look at it. Rather than finding whatever letter John had intended for her to read though, she instead discovers a letter left by Hoffman, in which he reveals that he knows she was there with Cecil the night Jill lost Gideon, and threatens to tell John if she doesn't kill Lynn. So, although Jeff's made it through all of his tests, and despite John ordering her to free Lynn, Amanda shoots her through the back, just as Jeff enters the room, prompting him to then return the favor with a shot through Amanda's neck. And as she bleeds out, John informs her that she'd failed her test. Following her death, John then presents Jeff with his final test by offering him the choice between killing him or just walking away. And of course, Jeff decides to kill John, slicing his throat with a circular saw. But in doing so, he also ends up killing Lynn, whose head is suddenly blasted off by her shotgun collar. With their test now out of the way, let's go back and run through Officer Rigg, Agent Strom, and Agent Perez's game, which begins around the same time as Jeff's, with Rigg, after being attacked and incapacitated at his apartment by Hoffman in a pig mask, awakening to a 90-minute alarm and a video message from Billy the Puppet, informing him that Eric Matthews is still alive and is currently trapped on a block of ice alongside Detective Hoffman, who Jigsaw's chosen to add to the game undercover so he can make sure everything goes as intended. Jigsaw then wraps up his message by emphasizing that the two detectives' lives hang in the balance of Rigg's obsession, and that, in order to truly save them, he must learn to let go. In addition to this, Rigg also soon finds photos of some of the game's victims hung up on the wall in his apartment, before then stumbling upon a woman stuck in a scalping trap named Brenda, who, another video message explains, is actually a pimp who forces young girls to work for her as prostitutes. So Jigsaw urges Rigg not to try and save her, and to instead just walk away. But still, he decides to try and help her anyway, and eventually manages to free her, although not before some pretty severe damage is done. But just moments after being freed, she suddenly attacks him with a hidden knife, so he's forced to grab her by her half torn off scalp and take her down, before he then finds her tape that Jigsaw had left, in which he told her that, in order to guarantee her freedom, she'd have to kill the officer that saves her. Meanwhile, over at the police station, Agents Strom and Perez soon receive a report of shots fired at Rigg's apartment, so they, along with a team of officers, make their way over. They only end up finding the photos and messages Jigsaw left for him along the walls and Brenda's dead body though, since Rigg had already left and begun making his way to the Alexander Motel, after he'd found a key to one of the motel's rooms alongside another key that he'll need to use later. But amongst the photos, Strom does find one potentially important person, with that person being John's ex-wife, Jill Tuck, who the two agents next bring in for questioning. When Rigg eventually makes it to his room at the motel, he once again finds another tape, and in this one, Jigsaw orders him to kidnap the motel's owner, as Ivan must begin his own test, which is set up in another room behind a door reading "Feel What I Feel" if Rigg wants to get any closer to finding Matthews and Hoffman. So Rigg does just that and takes him through the door, behind which Jigsaw has left photographic and video evidence of Ivan having raped multiple women, which proves to be enough for Rigg to force him into the trap that Ivan ultimately fails. Rigg then moves on to his next clue, which comes in the form of a note reading, "Become the teacher and save a life. Go back to where it all began," which prompts a flashback to a few years ago when Rigg and Hoffman were dealing with a case of child abuse. Unfortunately, in this case, the little girl named Jane was too scared to tell on her father, Rex, so they were unable to do anything about the situation. But this didn't sit right with Rigg, especially since the father was acting so smug, and he ultimately lost control of his emotions, resulting in him punching Rex in the face multiple times. This then led to Rex immediately trying to press charges through his lawyer, John's former friend, Art Blank. But this attempt was quickly thwarted thanks to Hoffman, who lied and said that Rex swung at Rigg first. Having related this note back to that particular memory, Rigg heads over to the school where his attack on Rex took place, and there he finds Rex and his wife Morgan, who herself was also a victim of his abuse, hung up in their own test, which had actually already been completed prior to his arrival. For their test, the two were strung up in the air back to back, with spikes piercing through each other's bodies. But while the spikes were pierced through non-vital locations in Morgan's body, they'd been fatally arranged for Rex. So, if she wanted to save herself, then Rex would have had to die. And ultimately, she chose to end his life in order to save her own. Rigg soon finds their tape revealing the rules of their game, before then also finding a photo of his wife with a note telling him to go home on the back. But, upon noticing that the G on the note is written in the same font as the G in the Gideon Meatpacking Plant's logo, he decides to press forward, and after setting off the fire alarm so that Morgan can be found quickly, he heads over to the building. Strom and Perez, meanwhile, with their interrogation of Jill not really helping them find Rigg or Jigsaw, leave her for a moment to take a look at the scene of Ivan's death. And when they arrive at the motel, they're informed that the room Ivan's trap was set up in had actually been rented for the last 6 days to Art Blank, who's recently gone missing, and this leads the two agents to believe that he may be another of Jigsaw's accomplices. In actuality though, Art had been put through his own test a few days earlier, which he managed to survive, and following his victory, he was then forced with a device strapped on his back into this game, and left to watch over Matthews and Hoffman until the timer runs down. Shortly after taking a look around the motel, the two agents are then forced to shift their attention to the school, where Morgan's finally able to get some medical assistance, and once at the school, Perez learns that the building is actually co-owned by Art Blank and Jill Tuck. So they begin cautiously taking a look around and come across an office with Billy the Puppet seated inside, along with a tape for Perez, informing her that soon Agent Strom will take the life of an innocent man, before the puppet then begins making a strange noise that prompts Perez to lean closer to it just as Billy's face suddenly explodes, resulting in shards of the doll severely wounding her. With his partner now stuck fighting for her life, Strom begins aggressively interrogating Jill about her and Art Blank's connections to Jigsaw, as well as the messages he'd left behind at each crime scene, particularly the one reading, "Four walls build a home," which she reveals to be the Urban Renewal Group's motto, and this ultimately brings them circling back to the location of the company's first purchase, the Gideon Meatpacking Plant, where Rig has already arrived. After making his way through the building, Rig eventually finds a door reading, "Final Test," behind which Blank, Matthews, and Hoffman are being held. So, with the timer approaching 0, he rushes through it to save them. But this ends up being the wrong choice, since the final test door had actually been connected to a device holding two giant ice blocks above Matthews' head, who tried to prevent Rig from entering by shooting him through the door with a gun Blank had given him. But that ultimately didn't work, and Rig opening the door results in the blocks coming down and killing Eric. Blank had also attempted to stop Rig from coming in by rushing at him, but this just resulted in him getting shot as well. And as Art dies, he hands Rig his final tape, explaining how if he would have just let go of his obsession to save everyone, then Matthews would still be alive, before Rig's then left to bleed to death by Hoffman. Meanwhile, in a separate section of the building, Strom has finally made his way inside and attempts to locate Rig, but he instead ends up inadvertently tailing Jeff all the way to the end of his game, after which Strom enters the room where John, Amanda, and Lynn's deaths had all gone down, prompting Jeff to aim his gun at him, which in turn forces Strom to shoot and kill him, before Strom's then locked inside by an unseen Hoffman. Not too long after being locked inside though, Strom manages to find a hidden door within the room, but it turns out he was meant to, as he's quickly knocked out by Hoffman in a pig mask just as he begins making his way through the halls. And when he eventually wakes up, Strom finds himself stuck in a water box trap. He's able to avoid drowning though, after fortunately finding his pen still in his pocket and using it to give himself a tracheotomy, which helps him survive long enough for police to arrive. Sometime later, after Strom's mostly healed from his wound, he begins to become suspicious of Hoffman, as he finds it hard to believe that Jigsaw would have possibly left a flaw in his game that could have allowed Hoffman to break free of his restraints. But it appears he's the only one who feels this way, as Hoffman, for his part in solving the Jigsaw case, actually gets a promotion to detective lieutenant. Still though, Hoffman sees Strom as a problem that needs to be dealt with, especially after he receives an anonymous note in his office reading, "I know who you are." But although Hoffman believes this note to be from Strom, it had actually been sent by Dr. Lawrence Gordon, whose work alongside Jigsaw was kept hidden from Hoffman all this time, and now, with John dead, Gordon has decided to deliver this message to keep him in check. Hoffman doesn't take the message as intended though, and it instead leads him to prepare a plan against Strom, in which he'll look to pin him as a Jigsaw accomplice before ultimately killing him. And for this plan, Hoffman will also be using the next of John's planned games to his advantage, which focuses on 5 selfish people: Ashley, Charles, Luba, Malik, and Britt, who were all in some way involved in a case of arson that resulted in the deaths of 8 people, and who will now be put through a series of tests in hopes that they'll learn to fight off their selfish instincts and work together. A majority of the 5 failed to change their ways, unfortunately, and die as a result, with Ashley at one point being pulled into a razor blade by a cable around her neck and decapitated, Charles being blown to pieces by nail bombs, and Luba being killed by Britt as a means of completing their second to last tests. But by the final test, Malik and Britt finally realized that they all could have survived the game if they had just worked together. And so, with this realization, they're able to both make it out of the game alive. Meanwhile, as this was taking place, Hoffman's plan basically went off without a hitch, as he, after planting some evidence to make it appear Strom had set the whole thing up, was able to lure the cops to the game's location while also managing to lure Strom to his house, and in turn, down into the tunnels leading to the dilapidated bathroom. He wouldn't use the bathroom to get rid of Strom, however, as he instead set up a trap in a separate room involving a large glass box that John Kramer had actually created years ago. And Strom, although appearing to have the upper hand for a moment after managing to slam Hoffman into the box, would ultimately fail this test, since it turns out entering the box was his only chance of survival, as it suddenly begins lowering into the ground while the walls begin closing in until eventually Strom is completely crushed to death. With Strom dead, Hoffman finishes covering things up using another game John had planned prior to his death, focused on two loan sharks named Simone and Eddie, who, for their test, Hoffman has locked inside helmets with built-in screws aimed at their temples that'll pierce the skull of whoever fails to cut off more of their own flesh in the next 60 seconds. And after Simone ultimately wins by chopping off her own arm, resulting in Eddie being killed by the device, Hoffman then sets up the crime scene for when the police arrive, placing Strom's fingerprints on Eddie's eyelids. So with that, Hoffman believes everything leading back to him as a Jigsaw accomplice has been dealt with. But shortly after the discovery of Eddie's corpse, while the police morgue's coroner, Dr. Adam Heffner, is examining the body, Hoffman realizes that he'd made a potentially grave error, as Dr. Heffner reveals that, while the puzzle pieces left on Jigsaw's victims have usually been cut out using a scalpel, Eddie's corpse was cut using a serrated blade, which had only been used once before by Jigsaw on the body of Seth Baxter, the man who killed Hoffman's sister. Upon learning this information, Special Agent Dan Erickson and the fully recovered Agent Lindsay Perez decide they're going to take a look at the tape from Seth Baxter's Jigsaw trap and decode the voice to see if it was recorded by someone else other than Jigsaw.
Strong.
Yeah, maybe.
The feds aren't the only ones getting uncomfortably close to discovering Hoffman's secret identity, though, as unbeknownst to Hoffman, an investigative journalist named Pamela Jenkins has recently come across some information that could potentially make things difficult for him, with that discovery being of the blackmail letter he'd left for Amanda. And in an attempt to get a better understanding of the story behind the letter, Pamela now gives it to Jill Tuck. Throughout everything that's been going on with Hoffman, Jill's been dealing with some Jigsaw-related stuff of her own, as following John's death, she had received a black box that John had left for her in the event of his death. And after opening it using the key he'd given her during their last conversation, its contents are revealed to be 6 numbered envelopes, 5 of which contain photos and information on the next several test subjects, while the 6th actually includes a photo of Hoffman, another package addressed to Dr. Gordon, and lastly, a new and improved reverse bear trap. Jill hasn't really done anything with any of this information yet though, other than turn over the 5 envelopes to Hoffman, who was aware of her box's existence, although not what was inside other than the envelopes. But now Jill, having received this letter from Pamela, decides to see out John's final requests, beginning with delivering the package he'd left for Dr. Gordon. We'll get back to that a bit later, but for now, let's go back to Pamela Jenkins, who shortly after delivering the letter to Jill, is suddenly kidnapped by Hoffman in a pig mask. Since it turns out she's actually one of the many victims of John's next game, focusing on her brother, William Easton, the manager of the Umbrella Health Insurance Company, who'd caused the death of numerous sick people, including John Kramer himself, by denying them coverage of their treatment costs for fabricated reasons. During Easton's game, he's put through a series of tests involving a number of his employees who are almost all ultimately killed, including the janitor Hank, who's killed by the oxygen crusher trap, his file clerk Alan, who's killed in a test that forced Easton to choose between saving him or his secretary Addie, the company's lawyer Debbie, who's killed in the steam maze trap, and his 6 insurance inspectors, Shelby, Aaron, Emily, Gina, Dave, and Josh, 4 of whom are killed by the shotgun carousel trap, while Shelby and Emily survive. Following this test, Easton then heads down the hallway and follows an arrow pointing him in the direction of his family to where his sister is being held. But unfortunately, in another cell beside hers are Tara Abbott and her son Brent, the wife and son of a man named Harold Abbott, whose treatment Easton refused to cover, resulting in his death. And so, for Easton's final test, his life has been put into Tara and Brent's hands, and ultimately, it's Brent who decides to kill him. So he pulls down the lever at his disposal, which results in a huge rack of needles filled with hydrofluoric acid swinging down into Easton's back that eventually melts him in half. Jumping back to Hoffman now though, whose cover is completely blown once Erickson and Perez manage to decode his Seth Baxter tape. So he's forced to immediately kill them as well as the other officer in the room named Sachi, before setting the place on fire and heading back to his hideout in the abandoned Rowan Zoology Institute, where Easton's game had been taking place. But when he gets there, he, after finding a copy of his letter to Amanda on his desk, is suddenly electrocuted and incapacitated by Jill, who then places John's new model of the reverse bear trap on his head and leaves him to die. He miraculously manages to escape the device though, by slamming his head through the door's barred window, which allows him enough time to slide out the bottom of the trap just before it overpowers the bars and goes off. Jill, upon witnessing him break free of the device from just outside the room, promptly runs and hides as he begins making his way through the halls. And fortunately for her, she's able to remain hidden as he exits the building. But still, for the next 10 months, Jill's left living in fear that Hoffman will one day find and kill her. So feeling she has no other option, she eventually decides to go to the police, but specifically asks to speak with Internal Affairs Officer Matt Gibson, since he's had some issues of his own with Hoffman in the past. A few years back, when Gibson was still a patrol cop, and as he was responding to a distress call at an abandoned Crossroads manufacturing warehouse, he was suddenly attacked and held up with his own gun by a junkie. Although not for long, as the junkie was quickly disarmed by Hoffman, who then went ahead and shot the man through the back 3 times. As a result of this encounter, Gibson transferred over to Internal Affairs, where he began taking down some of Hoffman's corrupt underling cops. And now, he finally has the opportunity to take Hoffman down as well. So he agrees to offer Jill protection and complete immunity in exchange for her help. Hoffman, meanwhile, has decided to still continue on with more of Jigsaw's games, even while in hiding. So he set up 2 separate games, the first of which takes place at the abandoned Clear Dawn Psychiatric Hospital, and focuses on a man named Bobby Dagan, who had risen to fame by posing as a Jigsaw survivor, despite him never having actually been tested. So John's prepared a real series of tests for him that Hoffman now puts into motion. For each of Bobby's tests, he's given a task to potentially save his closest friends and associates, but ultimately, he fails to actually save any of them, with his publicist Nina being killed during his first test by the Silence Circle trap, his lawyer Suzanne being killed during his second test by the impalement wheel, his best friend Cal being killed via hanging during his third test, and his wife Joyce being killed during his final test by the Brazen Bull trap. Hoffman's second Jigsaw game takes place inside a garage at Pete's Auto Body junkyard and is focused on a group of 4 neo-Nazis, including Evan, his girlfriend Kara, and their friends Dan and Jake. For their test, Evan finds himself glued to the driver's seat of an El Camino, which is held up by several jacks, while Kara's tied up just beneath the back wheel of the vehicle. Dan's arms and lower jaw are chained to the El Camino's rear, and Jake's chained to the garage door in front of it. And in order to prevent the car from dropping and kickstarting a fatal chain of events, Evan has to reach and pull a red lever placed through the windshield in the next 30 seconds, as well as in turn tear off a good amount of his skin. A task he's ultimately unable to complete, so each of them are killed as a result. With each of the game's participants dead, Hoffman next looks to use this crime scene as a way of getting closer to Jill, which he does by planting a bomb within the junkyard for when Gibson and his men later arrive to check things out. Although he doesn't intend on using this bomb to actually kill anyone in particular, but rather plans on using the distraction to swap places with one of the neo-Nazis' corpses and sneak into the precinct in a body bag, which actually ends up working. So once inside, Hoffman goes on a killing spree, taking down 6 people within the precinct on his way to finding Jill, in addition to killing 8 officers, including Gibson, remotely, with booby traps left at the locations of Bobby and Evan's games. So, with no one left to protect her, Hoffman's able to kidnap Jill, place her in the original reverse bear trap, and watch as the device kills her. And now, with seemingly everyone finally dealt with, Hoffman prepares to go on the run, but his attempt to leave this all behind him is quickly thwarted by Dr. Lawrence Gordon, who intercepts and subsequently incapacitates him. It turns out that the package John had left for Jill to deliver to Gordon earlier contained a video message in which John asked Gordon to watch over Jill and to act immediately if anything were to happen to her. So, with Hoffman having killed her, Gordon now takes him to the dilapidated bathroom and chains him to the pipe by his ankle, just as John had once did to him. But this time around, Hoffman isn't left with any way to escape his shackles, and instead is just left to die as Gordon slams the door behind him. Since this is the last we see of Gordon or Hoffman in the franchise, let's shift our focus back to Logan Nelson, who we learn during his time serving for the US Army had ended up being held prisoner and tortured for 5 months and 11 days until he was released in a prisoner exchange in May of 2005. After which he was then transferred to the VA Capital Healthcare Network, where he would receive PTSD treatment for the following 23 months. Once having managed to deal with his PTSD, Logan, now working as a police pathologist, was able to begin enjoying a happy life with his wife Christine and their daughter Melissa, and presumably didn't think about returning to his life as a Jigsaw accomplice. Although that all changed around 7 years later, when his wife was suddenly killed one day by a criminal and drug addict named Edgar Munson, who ended up not serving almost any jail time for his crime, thanks to a detective named Brad Halloran, since Edgar was his criminal informant. And Halloran had actually protected multiple other criminals from jail time as well, a few of whom ended up committing sudden murders of their own. So Logan blames Halloran for his wife's death and looks to get revenge using John Kramer's old methods. To do this, Logan prepares a game identical to the one John had placed him in all those years ago, although his game only includes 3 participants, each of whom were criminals set free by Halloran rather than John's 5, since he plans on making himself and Halloran the final 2, and his game ultimately goes down 2 years following his wife's death in around 2016. To begin, Logan kidnaps and places Edgar Munson in an abandoned building alongside a tape he'd created by splicing up old audio clips of John Kramer from past tests. And in this tape, he orders Edgar to get into a car chase with the police and lead them, as well as Detective Halloran specifically, back to the roof of this building, where he'll then find a device placed behind a drawing of an X that will allow him to make a choice. Either pull the trigger to start a separate game that will likely result in the deaths of 5 people, or don't pull the trigger and allow himself to die. So Edgar does as instructed and eventually finds himself surrounded by Halloran and his fellow officers, all of whom Halloran orders not to kill Edgar and just to aim for his hand. But when Edgar ultimately pulls the trigger, he not only ends up with his hand blown off, but also a bullet in his stomach, which is revealed to have been the doing of Logan from across the way atop another building with a sniper rifle. Meanwhile, Logan's game at the pig farm simultaneously begins, and those involved each eventually die, with the first being sliced by the circular saws during the first test, the second dying the same way as Carly, and the third dying in the same way as Mitch, before Logan, after having planted evidence to make it appear Halloran was the one behind the new Jigsaw game, then lures Halloran to the game's location and places each of them in laser collar traps. Although Logan's is of course a decoy, which he pretends to be killed by in order to get a confession out of Halloran.
Innocent people died because of me, I did it!
That'll be used as the final piece to pin all of this on him. And once he has that confession recorded, he activates Halloran's laser collar, killing him. After Logan's game at the pig farm, he or any other still alive Jigsaw accomplices remain inactive for the next few years. And instead, the city falls victim to a copycat Jigsaw killer in the form of Detective William Shank, also known as the Spiral Killer, who, when he was young, witnessed his father shot dead by a corrupt police officer, Peter Dunleavy. So, as he grew up, he worked towards becoming a detective so he could target corrupt officers from the inside. And he eventually gets this opportunity, with him placing several cops into traps, including Dunleavy, that ultimately killed them. Another detective and Shank's partner, Zeke Banks, who was openly against corrupt cops, would soon become aware of this Spiral Killer and began a mission to track him down, which he eventually did, but in the end, he was unable to arrest Shank or get any incriminating evidence against him, so he still continues to walk free. And that was everything you needed to know before watching Saw X. If you enjoyed the video or found it helpful in any way, then make sure to leave a like and subscribe to the channel. And also, let us know in the comments below which Saw film was your favorite, and which character you're most excited to see make a return. But once again, thank you all so much for watching, and I'll talk to you again soon.